Hello everyone. So today we're just going to continue on with our pizza ordering system. And essentially what we're going to do is we're going to make a class to contain the pizza types. So essentially that class we're going to instantiate objects from and populate this drop-down list. And I'm going to start really simple here and really explain it. So I'll try to keep this as beginner friendly as possible. And I've got a little diagram here. So we'll start with kind of explaining. This is sort of how we're going to get from the class all the way down into that drop-down list. So in this tutorial, we're just going to make the class right here. This is what we're going to work on this time. So kind of just try to explain what a class is. It's sort of an empty object or framework to contain data. So in our case here, the data we're going to want to contain is within the pizza types table. So in the pizza types table, we have a type ID and the pizza that's associated with that ID. So we want to be able to contain this in something on our program side because this is just on the database. So what we can do is we can make a class. And from this class, we can make objects for each of the specific types of pizza. So now, again, I'll be the first to admit that I don't know everything, and I could be confusing some terms and terminology, specifically attributes and properties. That is terminology that I'm confused by, so if people can clear it up in the comments, please let me know if I'm getting my terms mixed up. But essentially, in a class, you have kind of two main things, sort of an attribute or a property, and that's sort of if you consider a car, it can have a color, it can have four wheels. Those are sort of attributes of the car. And then, methods or functions is the car can move forward or like drive forward, or you could have it brake, it could stop, it can turn on, it can turn off, etc., etc. In our pizza example, our two attributes are going to be type ID and the pizza. Those are going to be our attributes. And that comes from the column names. So we got a type ID and we have a pizza. And the class is going to have those attributes. And again, the class is sort of like this empty framework. It's not actually the object itself. And what we can do is we can instantiate, I kind of lost my mouse. There we go. We can instantiate a class into an object. And that's when we take the class, this empty framework, and actually add real attributes to it. So for example, we can say here that the attributes are type ID is 1 and the pizza is a cheese pizza. So we can fill in this sort of framework for our class with the object. And again, that's just our first one. We could then fill in this, we can make another object from this same class, and it could be type ID 2, and the pizza would be deluxe. So the next object would have, this would be 2, and then this would say deluxe. And in that way, we can take all of the data from the database and put it into a container or an object like a class and use it programmatically in our program. So that's sort of what we're doing here we're going to make the class in this tutorial. But just to kind of move a little forward to get the big picture, once we have these objects, we can then take those objects and put it into a list in Python. And again, here I've just kind of like put it out here. So we've got 4 objects here, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. And we could put each of those objects into this list. And the benefit of having these, using object-oriented is you can see object 1 can be type ID 1 and pizza can equal cheese. And then object 2 can have type ID 2 and pizza equals deluxe. So it would be challenging to try to do this just with like strings, for example. But by using an object, we can have multiple different attributes and even methods and functions within that object, all just sitting in an object, one specific object. And then we can put those specific objects into a list And then from that list, we can put that into the drop-down list or the combo box on the GUI. And if we want to just say display, we can just take from the object and only display just the pizza, right? We just want the name to be dropped down in the drop-down list. We don't need the type. But if we remember, we need the type to get to the pizza toppings because we made a relationship between both the pizza type and the pizza toppings. And it's by the type ID, not the pizza name. So that's why we kind of want to store kind of both this data in the object. So when a person selects from the drop-down list a cheese pizza, well, we know that the cheese pizza object has a type ID of 1. And then we can requery the database to get the toppings from that pizza. So that's sort of the benefit here of using object-oriented. So in this tutorial, we're just going to make the class. And then in following tutorials, we'll kind of fill out the rest of this. But that's just sort of the direction we're going in. So if we go to the code, we can kind of make the class right away. And what we can do is often classes are called models, especially in the model view controller concept. So we can make a new directory just to store all of our classes because we'll make another class for the pizza toppings as well. So what we'll do is we'll just right click here and we'll say new directory and we'll call it just models. And you could call this really whatever you wanted. You could call it classes if you wanted to. And inside of here, we are going to make a new file and we're going to give it a name for this class. And by convention, classes are with a capital letter and then the objects that you instantiate from that class are with a lowercase letter. But it really doesn't matter as long as it makes sense. So our class in our case here is going to be, let's see here, we should call, because we're making pizza types is the table name. So I'll make the class name the same. So pizza types. So pizza types.py. And then all we have to do here is type class. And then again with a capital pizza types. And you didn't have to name the file the same as the class name, but I'm just doing that just for clarity for myself. So that's the first step. We've sort of declared a class, but now we have to be able to fill this class with its attributes somehow. And this is done with what's called a constructor. So in order to make a constructor, at least in Python, it's different with C#. With like Java and C#, it's a little bit different. Python has its sort of own way of doing this, but you have to declare a init, which is to initialize basically the object, but it is sort of the constructor, so we can put here constructor basically in a comment. And then in that, we're going to basically need to have two things, right? We're going to have two things, and that's the two attributes, the type ID and pizza. So we can say self.__type ID, and this is one attribute, and that's going to equal the type ID. Now, what does this self mean? Why did I put some underscores here? And where is this type ID coming from? Those are great questions. So let's start with answering the question, well, okay, great, Simon. I understand that you're taking this sort of variable here and you're setting it to this, but that doesn't exist. Well, that's right. So we're going to put it in here. We're going to pass it into the constructor, the type ID. And then the next thing we're going to pass into the constructor is the name of the pizza. So name. And then here, what we're going to do is we're going to go self.__name, and that's going to be equal to the name. So essentially, when we instantiate this object from this class, we're going to input the type ID, and we're going to input the name, and then that's going to be setting these internal variables of this class, essentially. Now, this ___ is sort of simulating sort of private or protected, keeping this variable private. And this is, I believe, a concept of encapsulation. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong. I could definitely be making mistakes here, so with the terminology and stuff. So I'd be happy to be corrected if I'm making mistakes. But my understanding is that these we're basically going to use encapsulation. So you encapsulate these variables, which protects them basically from other programmers, altering this data, because we don't want this data to be corrupted by accident by somebody else, using this class and then changing the ID. We don't want that by accident. So this underscore underscore kind of replicates putting it to private, which is what you would do with like C# or Java. So if you're familiar with object-oriented, you know now that we also need some getters and setters, because the issue with making this private, and this is a good point if you're wondering this, well, okay, great, Simon. So we're going to put in data, the type ID and the name into this, into this class, like type ID 1, and the name is cheese pizza. Well, it's useless if we can't access this data. And we don't want to access the data directly from here. So what we can do is we can set up getters, which are functions used to get these bits of data. So again, and maybe I should just clarify here, this just means to define, define a method or a function. And this, we can call it get type ID. And we can simply put here, and it's going to get it, so we can return. What we're going to want to return is self.__ type ID. And that's how we can get this variable here without having to call it directly. And as you can see here, I've got my indentations a little bit messed up. So what we have to do is we have to just tab that back. And you can do that by going Shift-Tab. And then we are going to have to put self into there. And basically, what is this self here for? So when we instantiate this object, and when we get around to instantiating these classes, I'll kind of explain this a little more. But this, I believe, takes in the variable name. And then we're going to pass in the type ID of 1 or 2, and then the pizza name that's associated with that type ID. So this self is just taking in whatever it is, the object that you called it. And here, I'll kind of write it out here. So when we instantiate this class object, what we're going to do is we're going to say pizza types equals, and like I said, it's just sort of a convention when you're making an object or instantiating an object from a class, you just put it to lowercase. And then all you have to do, and in other languages you might have to put new and then type in whatever your class name is, and you do all this. But in Python, it's really simple. You literally just type in pizza types, and again, as you can see, this is the capital letter now because it's the class, and that's it. So, well, okay, so we're not done yet. That's not it. But so that's the class, and this is the object we're going to instantiate from the class. And then we'd have to type in, 1 and cheese, because I think that's what it was, right? We said 1 is cheese. So all we could do here, and when we get around to doing this from the database, we're going to dynamically generate it. But this is just for demonstration purposes to try to understand it. So this is how we could potentially instantiate this class right here. We would take the class name and instantiate 1 and cheese. So what does this associate to here in the constructor? Well, the pizza types, which is the object name, is referring to self, I believe. And please correct me if I'm getting that wrong, but I'm pretty sure that's what's happening. And then it takes, okay, this type ID is 1. Okay, great. And then the name is cheese, and that's it. So then these 3 variables associate to 1, 2, and 3. And that's how you could make this object. And then if we wanted to, let's say, access the type ID, we can call our method here, get type ID from the object by going dot, and then just get type ID. And then that is how we could basically extract, we can extract it into a variable called type ID equals, and that's how we can extract it. And then, when we put it into the drop-down list, we're going to want to have another getter, and we're going to call it get name. And then we're going to return the self.__ name. And then, ultimately in the drop-down list, we're not going to want to put the type IDs into there. We're going to want to put the names into there. So we can access the bits of data quite easily with this sort of object-oriented syntax. So I'll just delete that for now, because we've got the getters and we've got the getter set up. And we could also set up some setters. So what do I mean by a setter? So I'll just put a comment here, and we can say that these are the getters. and these, we're going to make some setters here. So for the setters, we could, for example, we might want to set the name, right? Maybe we want to reset type ID 1 to a different type of pizza of some time. So we can make a set name, and we'll pass in the name. And essentially, we'll just set self.__name equal to the name. And there we go. And then now you can reset the names of the type IDs if you wanted to. Now, here's a point of why we would encapsulate data. Would we ever want to change the type ID? Well, maybe not, right? Maybe we don't want someone, to ever change the type ID. So we won't set up a setter, called set type ID. Because these IDs are sort of fixed, they're auto-incrementing, right? We always want type ID 1 to be associated with the cheese pizza, for example. Or type ID 1 should always be set to whatever we've set the cheese, whatever we set that pizza to with this setter. We don't want to be able to all of a sudden put another type ID 1 in by accident and say, oh, type ID 1 is cheese and pepperoni. Well, which one is type ID 1 referring to anymore? Well, because we've used encapsulation and we've made this type ID private, there actually is, unless you go into the code and, change it, it sort of protects from that sort of data corruption because there's no way to set the type ID. And actually, furthermore, what we could do here, and this happens sometimes, is let's say you have a date instead of, this is an integer and this is a string. But let's say you had a date, and sometimes dates can be null values. So you could even do a little bit of checking here. You could say, if we had another, let's just pretend we had another column with date here. And then you could say if date equals none, which is null, then you want to set self.__date. Maybe you want to set it to 0 because you don't want it to be just a null value or something, or whatever. Maybe this isn't the best example, but you could say else, if it's not null, set, self.__date equal to the date, right? You could do something like this, and maybe the date wasn't the best example, but maybe you want it to be a range of numbers or something, right? If it's less than 100, then set it to 100 because you want 100 to be your minimum, and if it's greater than 1,000, set it to 1,000 because you don't want any numbers over 1,000. You could sort of control how things are set within the constructor, but we don't have to do that here because we don't really have a situation where we would need to do that. And like I said here, we've left out the type ID as a setter because we don't want to have to set that type ID. In addition here, you could also, let's say you want methods specifically for these objects. You could type in other methods that are not just getters and setters, all kinds of other methods you could set here for each specific object itself, and maybe you just want to call a method just on the deluxe pizza. Well, if that's the case, you could just call it, on that pizza. So let's say, so how would you do that? Well, if we look at the list here, let's say the deluxe pizza is, let's see, which one is it? It's object 2 in the list, which means it's at the 0, 1 index, right? 0, because this is 0 on the index, this is 1, this is 2, and this is 3. So what you could do is you could target, okay, index 1 in the list is the deluxe pizza, and we want to just specifically do whatever method to it. And that's why you could add, other methods in here besides just getters and setters. So that's pretty much it. I think that's where we're going to kind of finish off with this this tutorial. Please leave questions in the comments if you have questions about, what exactly object-oriented is. I know it's kind of a little bit confusing. At least I found it confusing when I first started trying to understand these concepts. This is just the class. So all we've built so far is just this class right here. We haven't instantiated it. We haven't done any of the rest of this yet. We've kind of just done up to here. We've made a class, which is an empty framework for each of these pizza types in our database. So now we can take pizza ID 1 and cheese, store it into this class by instantiating it into an object, and then we can, like I said, put it into a list and do some useful things with it. So this is a class, and this is how you kind of make a class in Python. So thanks for all the support and all the subscriptions and likes. And in the next video, we'll actually instantiate this into an object. And thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one.